how does the Western media cover war? It seems to depend on where the conflict is. Early coverage of the Russian invasion of Ukraine brought with it a bevy of criticism against journalists from Western nations who were quick to compare that war to conflicts in the Middle East and Africa.
Well, these are not obviously refugees trying to get away from areas in the Middle East.
On est au 21e siècle, on est dans une ville européenne et on a des tirs de missiles de croisière comme si on était en Irak ou en Afghanistan, vous imaginez?
This is a relatively civilized, relatively European city where you wouldn't expect that or hope that it's going to happen.
What we've seen since the beginning of this conflict in Ukraine is just an egregious level of this type of commentary, that there has been no evolution in terms of comparing the suffering of people in a country like Ukraine as being somehow unique as opposed to the suffering of people in Syria or Iraq or Afghanistan, which is a conflict we've seen quite recently.
Charlie D'Agata and Al Jazeera were quick to offer apologies for on-air statements. BFM did not respond to CNN's request for comment.
Comparing one to the other or placing a higher value or a higher shock at something happening simply because it's closer to Europe or closer to white faces, then that's extremely problematic for us. What we're doing is we're perpetuating stereotypes, and that's where it's quite dangerous.
That's the real challenge of international journalism. You come about from country to country to really understand each society as its own specific situation. So I would agree that we can do better, that we must do better and show more understanding.
I think white people see themselves in Ukrainians, and that's okay. That's absolutely valid. I don't negate that at all, that experience. And to see yourself in an experience of someone or in a people's makes you compelled to act or to be perhaps more appalled at what you're seeing. But again, I've seen myself in the Middle Eastern conflicts for decades now.
I'm hailing the work that the journalists are doing, covering the human tragedy.
Zahera Harb, a Lebanese journalist who teaches at City University of London, argues that the compassion and emotion that have been seen in the coverage of Ukraine should force journalists to grapple with a central tenet of journalism: impartiality.
I really have questions about where is the impartiality rule now in the coverage of Ukraine. Okay? Not to say that I'm criticizing the coverage. What is happening is necessary. This is how you should, cover it. And this is where I question why it's applied for one conflict and it's not applied for another conflict. That compassion that we have seen in the coverage of Ukraine was not similarly seen in the coverage of Syria. And, at least in the coverage of Lebanon. There were some journalists who tried, and they were criticized because they are actually in breach of the, impartiality rule.
Harb cited Channel 4 presenter Jon Snow's coverage of Israel's bombardment of the Gaza Strip in 2014 as one example.
And I argue that, what Anglo-American journalists are doing now in covering Ukraine, they are really telling us that you can actually tell things as it is. You can be accurate in naming things as it is.
And while journalists can learn lessons from Ukraine for future reporting, Anthony Borden, founder of the Institute for War and Peace Reporting, argues that looking into the past would have better prepared us for what is now a shocking Russian invasion.
We focus on our own component of the story rather than the reality of what's actually happening in the story, and therefore we can't engage in the story at a time frame which could actually help or even prevent the conflict. And Ukraine really provides no better example than that.
Part of the 2019 phone call between President Volodymyr Zelensky and President Donald Trump that led to Trump's impeachment covered sanctions against Russia and arming Ukraine.
The entire country talked about an episode relating to Ukraine for a year, but what we never said was, why is it so important to give Ukraine arms? The reason is that Russia has a decades-long strategy to undermine its independence, attack its sovereignty, and prepare for war, which is exactly what's happening now, whether it's Belarus or whether it's here in Ukraine or whether it's parts of the territory of Georgia and elsewhere swinging into Central Asia. There was conflict here in 2014 when Russia seized Crimea and seized part of the eastern territories, and we didn't connect the dots. We saw them as individual, maybe crisis points along the way, and we weren't really focusing on the core of the problem, which was Russia's long-term expansionist designs.
Harb and Keshevars urge reporters to be more aware of what biases they may not know they have.
That kind of language has come from the fact that at times Journalists don't realize that if they are put in the spot in live coverage, what usually comes up is something that is also inherited from them, that comes in from their background, education, and knowledge of different people, of people maybe that they grew up to kind of like see in the light of certain stereotypes.
What we're seeing is this implicit bias. These are slip of the tongue moments that reflect an experience that you might not realize you entirely have. You don't feel comfortable admitting that you have it, but it is there.